I reached the cabin in early November of 2019, just as the afternoon light was starting to drop behind the far hills of northern Manitoba. The place sat deep in a quiet valley, almost swallowed by the trees, with a narrow gravel road that looked like it had not been driven on for weeks. The cabin belonged to an old coworker who let people use it when they needed time alone. I took the chance because I felt like I had been running on empty for months. I was 31 then, tired and spread thin from work, and I thought a few days in the cold quiet would give me some space to breathe. The air felt sharp the moment I stepped out of my car, carrying a mix of pine sap, old leaves, and frozen dirt. The cabin itself looked older than I expected, with dark wooden walls that seemed to sag slightly on one side. A metal chimney poked into the sky like a thin arm. I dragged my bag inside and noticed the smell immediately. Dust mixed with old firewood. A smell that felt harmless at first but slowly settled into my clothes. The place had one small bedroom, a narrow living area, and a bathroom that looked like it belonged in a place that rarely saw visitors. I had planned to unpack slowly, maybe make a fire, maybe sit outside for a bit before it got dark. But something about the silence inside the cabin kept me moving quicker than I meant to. It wasn't peaceful silence. It felt too thick, like the walls pressed it inward. Every step I took sounded louder than it should. Even my breathing felt too heavy in that still air. The first night passed quietly. I ate a simple meal, listened to the soft crackling of the small fire in the wood stove, and tried to settle my nerves. The cold outside grew deeper through the night, and the wind pushed against the walls in long, uneven waves. I slept lightly, waking every hour or so, unsure why my body felt alert even when nothing seemed wrong. The second day, I walked along the old trail behind the cabin. Frost covered the ground in thin sheets, and every step broke it with a soft crunch. The trees around me stood close together, tall and narrow, their bark darkened by the cold. I followed the trail for nearly 2 hours before turning back. Nothing unusual happened, yet I kept feeling like something was behind me. Every time I looked over my shoulder, I saw nothing but trees, shifting slightly with the slow wind. The longer I stayed out there, the more I felt small, like the forest stretched out in ways I couldn't see. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed something I had not seen before. A thin line of dark soil smeared across the front door, as if something had brushed against it. It looked fresh. I tried convincing myself I simply hadn't noticed it earlier. Maybe it had always been there. But a part of me felt like it hadn't. That night, something woke me up before dawn. A sound, faint but sharp, like a stick snapping close to the window by the bedroom. I stayed still for a long moment, listening. The wind had died down completely sometime in the night, so nothing outside should have made that kind of noise. I waited for more sounds, but nothing came. Eventually I got up, stepped into the living room, and felt the cold air pushing through a small gap in the window frame. I figured maybe the cold caused something outside to shift and snap, but the feeling in my chest didn't ease. By the fourth evening, things had changed. I felt watched, though I kept telling myself it was just isolation messing with my head. But the smallest things started to stand out, like the faint marks near the back porch, thin lines in the dirt that looked like footprints but were too smudged to tell. Cold skin brushed the back of my neck whenever I stepped outside at night, but the air was still. The trees around the cabin seemed closer each day, as if the forest pressed inward when I wasn't paying attention. That night, I sat by the fire for hours, staring into it, trying to calm the tightness in my chest. The fire cast a soft orange glow over the room, and the shadows in the corners stayed still. For the first time since arriving, I felt like maybe I was overthinking everything. That feeling lasted until I heard the slow, heavy steps on the porch outside. The steps didn't sound like an animal. Animals move with quickness or hesitation, but these steps were deliberate, steady, spaced apart like someone walking with careful weight. The wood creaked under each shift. I froze, my hands tightening around the arms of the chair. The fire crackled softly, sounding too loud in the silence. I stared at the front door, watching for any sign of movement, any shake in the frame. The steps stopped right in front of it. Then nothing. I sat like that for a long time, barely breathing, waiting for something else. A knock, another step, anything. The silence grew thicker, and the longer it stayed quiet, the more the hairs on my arms stood straight. I didn't move until the fire burned low and the room darkened, and even then I stayed awake until morning light finally touched the window. When I walked outside after the sun rose, I saw the footprints. Clear this time, too large to be from any animal in that region, spaced too evenly, shaped too much like human steps. They led from the tree line directly to the porch, then stopped at the front door. No prints returned to the forest, as if whoever stood there never walked away. I told myself then that I would leave the next morning. I didn't pack yet, but I knew I wasn't staying another night. My hands shook when I tried to make breakfast. I barely ate. The air felt heavy, as if something pressed against the cabin from the outside. That evening, I forced myself to stay awake. I sat in the darkest corner of the living room where I could see both windows and the front door. Hours passed slowly. My breathing felt louder than the quiet outside. Around midnight, the wind picked up in short, sharp bursts, tapping branches against the walls. Then I heard it again, the steps. Slow, steady, the same rhythm as before. They approached the porch. The cabins would pop softly as if reacting to the pressure outside. The steps stopped again at the door, same place as the night before. But this time they didn't stay still. Something brushed against the door, a soft sound, as though fingers dragged lightly along the wood. My chest tightened so much I thought I might pass out. I waited, terrified of any movement, cold sweat sliding down my back. Minutes passed. Then the steps moved again, shifting weight, turning slightly. I heard them walk across the porch, slower than before, as if whoever or whatever it was wanted to be heard. The steps moved toward the side of the cabin, then toward the back. The sound disappeared behind the wall where the bedroom was. I didn't sleep at all that night. I stayed in the corner, gripping a heavy flashlight I found in a drawer. Every small sound made me flinch, and each passing minute felt stretched thin. When the sun rose, I didn't waste a second. I grabbed my bag, threw everything inside without checking, locked the cabin door even though I knew the lock meant nothing, and rushed to my car. My hands shook on the steering wheel as I pulled away, and I kept checking the rearview mirror every few seconds, expecting to see someone step out from the trees. I reached the main road in less than 10 minutes, faster than I probably should have driven on that rough path. Only when I saw open land ahead did something inside me finally loosen. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town and checked into a small roadside motel. Later that day, when I finally felt calm enough, I thought about everything again. I tried to explain it to myself in simple, real terms. Maybe it had been a stranger wandering through the woods, someone living off the land, someone who didn't want to be seen. Maybe it was a hunter passing by, though the size of the footprints and the silence of the forest made that hard to believe. But the truth was clear. Someone had come to that cabin. Someone had watched it closely enough to approach it in the dark. Someone stood at my door for 2 nights in a row, steady and silent, in the cold. I never went back to that cabin. I never asked my old coworker about it, never told him what happened. Even now, years later, when I think of the slow steps on the porch and the long silence after, I still feel the weight of that night pressing into my chest. I know exactly what I experienced, and I don't need an explanation. Some things are frightening simply because they happen, and because they remind you how thin the walls are between safety and danger. And that night, in that isolated cabin, I learned that the hard way. I had been driving for almost 8 hours when the road finally narrowed into a thin strip of broken asphalt, bending through empty farmland like something forgotten on purpose. It was late autumn of 2019, and the weather had already started to change. The sky was a pale gray sheet, and the clouds looked heavy, swollen with cold wind rather than rain. I had rented a tiny farm cabin in eastern Nebraska, far away from any town, because I needed a break from everything. I was 32 at the time, tired from work, tired from people, tired from the constant noise of my life. I thought a quiet place would help clear my head. The cabin sat at the far corner of an old farm that hadn't been used in years. The listing said the owner lived 2 miles away. The place was small and simple, just one room with a kitchen area, a bathroom, and an attic space above that I did not plan on using. It had a barn behind it, leaning to one side like it wanted to collapse but was still fighting the idea. All around the cabin were empty fields, flat and dull, stretching out until they met the faint line of distant trees. I got there just before the sun disappeared. The air felt colder than it should have been for early evening, and the wind moved through the fields in long waves that made the dry plants whisper. I carried my bags inside, dropped them near the small wooden table, and stood for a moment listening to the steady hum of the fridge and the faint ticking of the wall clock. I remember thinking the silence didn't feel peaceful the way I expected. It felt like the place had been waiting, holding its breath. I tried to settle in. I walked around the cabin, checked the windows, turned on the heater, and tried not to focus on how isolated everything felt. The nearest neighbor was at least a mile down the road. There were no lights anywhere, no sound of cars, no dogs barking in the distance, just fields, wind, and the cabin walls around me. That first night, I didn't sleep well. I lay in the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the constant tapping of branches against the cabin exterior. The wind made the whole structure creak, like an old ship shifting on dark water. Every few minutes I would hear something new. The heater groaning, the fridge clicking, what sounded like footsteps on the porch but was probably just the old boards moving with the temperature. I tried to tell myself it was all normal for a place this old. I must have slept for 2 hours at most. When I woke up, it was still dark, and the clock said 4:12 a.m. I felt a strange tension in my chest, the kind you get when you wake from a dream you can't remember, but that leaves you uneasy. I stayed in bed a while, staring at the window. The sky outside was pitch black, and the fields were nothing but a sea of darkness. The wind had stopped completely, which somehow made everything worse. The silence was too heavy, too perfect. The next morning, I tried to shake off the feeling. I made coffee, walked around the field behind the cabin, and tried to convince myself that I was just adjusting to being alone. The air was crisp, and frost covered the ground like a thin layer of crushed glass. The barn looked even more unstable in daylight, with the roof sagging inward and the wooden planks warped from years of weather. I walked past it without going inside. Something about the dark opening in the front made me uneasy, as if the shadows inside were thicker than they should be. The rest of the day was calm. I read a book, cooked a simple meal, and watched the sky turn orange and then red as the sun set. But that night things felt different. The moment the sun dipped below the horizon, a deep cold settled around the cabin. I checked the heater twice to make sure it was working. The temperature inside felt normal, but every time I looked toward the windows, it felt like something just beyond the glass was staring back. I went to bed early, hoping sleep would come easier than the night before, but it didn't. I kept drifting in and out of light sleep, waking up every hour with a feeling like someone had moved something in the room. At one point I woke because I heard a sharp tapping. Not wind, not branches. This was slow and spaced out, as if someone was touching the wall with the back of their knuckles. I lay still, holding my breath. The tapping came again, this time a little louder, near the corner of the cabin. Then it shifted, moving along the wall, like someone dragging their fingers across the wooden planks. I felt every muscle in my body tighten. I stayed in bed, staring at the dark ceiling, afraid to move. After a few minutes, it stopped. The silence returned, colder and heavier than before. I didn't get out of bed. I didn't check the windows. I stayed under the blanket until morning light finally showed through the curtain. When I stepped outside later, the air smelled like frozen earth. I walked around the cabin, expecting to see scratch marks or something that would explain the noise. But the walls were clean. No signs of animals, no loose boards. The grass around the cabin was undisturbed. I tried to tell myself it must have been the wood contracting in the cold, but the sound had been too deliberate, too slow, too real. That evening, I felt dread building long before the sun started going down. I kept checking the time, checking the locks, checking the windows. I felt stupid for being scared, but the feeling kept growing. Even the fields outside looked different. The dry plants didn't move the same way as before. The stillness felt unnatural, like the land itself was waiting for night to fall. By the time darkness came, I already knew I wasn't sleeping that night. I sat at the small table with a flashlight next to me even though the lights were on. I kept hearing faint sounds outside, soft crunches, like footsteps moving slowly through the frosted grass. Sometimes they seemed close to the cabin, sometimes farther away. I couldn't tell if it was an animal or something else. Every sound made my heartbeat feel heavier. Hours passed. When the heater shut off for a moment, the sudden silence made my chest tighten. It was then that I heard something inside the cabin. Not outside, inside. A soft thump above me in the attic. I stared at the ceiling. Another thump. Then a slow shift, like the weight of someone crawling across the old boards. My hands were shaking. I didn't want to move, but I knew I couldn't stay sitting there. I grabbed my flashlight and backed toward the front door. I kept the light pointed at the ceiling, expecting dust or loose boards to fall. The sound continued, slow shuffling across the attic floor, moving toward the far end of the cabin where the pull-down ladder was. The strange thing was that the attic door had been closed when I arrived, and I hadn't opened it. I had no reason to. No one should have been up there. I didn't wait to see anything. I grabbed my jacket, threw on my boots without tying them, and stepped outside. The cold air hit me like a wave, but I didn't care. I held the flashlight tight and walked fast toward my car, which sat 20 feet from the cabin. The frost made my breath cloud in front of me. Behind me, I heard a faint sound as the front door swung slightly, pushed by a breeze I couldn't feel. I didn't look back. I unlocked the car, got in, and started the engine. The headlights lit the cabin and the field around it. For a moment it looked calm, still, harmless. But I knew what I heard. I knew someone had been inside. I drove straight down the long dirt road, not caring about the bumps or the frost on the ground. I didn't stop until I reached the owner's house. I didn't tell them what happened. I didn't try to explain anything. I just handed back the keys and left without looking back. When I finally got home the next day, the tension in my chest slowly faded. I slept through the entire afternoon. But the thing that stayed with me wasn't the tapping on the wall or the footsteps in the attic. It was the moment when I walked outside that night and felt, with absolute certainty, that someone had been watching me the entire time I was in that cabin. Not a ghost, not a creature, person. And the worst part was the clear understanding that whoever it was had been up there long before I arrived. Probably the entire time. I never went back to Nebraska. I never tried to find out who had been living inside that attic. But I know what I felt and I know what I heard. And I know I left that place just in time, before the person hiding above me decided to come down. I never planned to spend a night near a graveyard, especially not in a small wooden cabin that looked like it was sinking into the ground. But in late October of 2019, when I was 32 and driving alone through a rural part of northern Poland, a sudden storm forced me off the main road. The rain came so fast and so heavy that my wipers couldn't clear the windshield. My phone's signal disappeared somewhere between two farms, and by the time I spotted the old iron gate that marked the entrance to a forgotten cemetery, I was desperate for any kind of shelter. Beside the gate was a narrow dirt track leading to a single wooden cabin, the kind that once might have been used by a groundskeeper decades ago. It looked abandoned, but it had a roof and walls, and that was enough for me. As I stepped out of the car, the cold rain slapped against my clothes so hard it felt like needles. The cabin sat just a few meters from the oldest part of the graveyard, and the whole place felt like it hadn't been visited in years. The tombstones closest to the fence were crooked, some pressed deep into the earth as if they were sinking. The fence itself was rusted and bent in places, with weeds growing around it so thick that the bars disappeared into the plants. The whole scene looked washed out in the storm, as if time itself had drained the color from everything. The cabin's door groaned when I pushed it open. Inside, the air was dry but filled with a stale smell, like old dust mixed with something earthy, almost like soil that had been trapped for too long. The wooden floor felt uneven under my shoes, the boards bending slightly with each step. In the corner sat a small metal cot frame with a thin mattress, so old that the fabric had faded into a pale gray. A single wooden table stood against the wall, and a cracked window looked directly toward the graveyard. Rain hammered the glass so hard the water blurred everything outside. I closed the door behind me and stood there for a moment, listening. There was no sound except the storm. Not even the wind found its way through the cracks in the walls, which surprised me. Cabins this old usually whistled on stormy nights, but this one stayed strangely quiet. Too quiet. Even the rain on the roof felt distant, almost muffled. I sat down on the old mattress, feeling it sag beneath me. My clothes were soaked through, and the cold crept deep into my bones. I rubbed my arms and tried to shake off the strange feeling that clung to me the moment I walked inside. Something about the cabin felt off. Not dangerous exactly, but wrong in a slow, creeping way, like a smell you can't place but know shouldn't be there. The storm didn't ease. Hours seemed to pass, though I had no way of checking the time. The light outside faded until the window became nothing more than a dark shape. The only illumination came from my phone's flashlight, which I kept pointed at the floor to save battery. Every now and then, I heard something short, dull thuds, like small stones hitting the cabin walls. I tried to tell myself it was the wind knocking debris around or tree branches blowing in the storm, but the pattern didn't match the wind. The sounds came at steady intervals, always at the same spot on the wall behind the cot. Eventually, curiosity pushed me to stand up and move toward the noise. I pressed my hand against the wall and felt a faint tremor with each thud. It was too regular, too intentional. A wave of uneasiness washed over me, stronger than before. The storm was bad, but something about the place outside the walls felt worse. My mind wandered to the cemetery beyond the window and the idea of rain hitting old metal or small rocks sliding down from uneven soil. I tried to convince myself it was nothing more than that, but the thuds continued, soft, steady, patient. I returned to the mattress but couldn't bring myself to lie down. I sat with my back against the wall opposite the window, staring into the dim space. The longer I sat there, the more the darkness around me seemed to shift. My eyes kept catching shapes that weren't there. Shadows seemed thicker in certain corners. The stale smell grew stronger, as if old earth was gathering in the air, creeping closer. At some point, the storm eased just enough that I could hear the faint sounds coming from outside. Not voices, just movement, rustling, something brushing against the weeds near the fence, something scraping lightly, like metal dragging on stone. My chest tightened as I forced myself not to imagine anything human or animal out there. I tried to steady my breathing, telling myself that graveyards had plenty of loose metal, fallen branches, and shifting soil. But then I heard footsteps. Slow, uneven footsteps on wet ground. They came from the direction of the gate. My hands went cold, my whole body turning rigid as I listened. The steps moved toward the cabin, each one heavy enough to sink into mud. They stopped near the window, and I could see a faint shape blocking what little outside light remained. Not a face, just a dark outline. The shape didn't move away for a long time. I sat frozen on the mattress, not daring to breathe too loud. My phone light lay dim on the floor, and I knew turning it off would make the entire cabin disappear into blackness. But leaving it on meant I could be seen, not clearly, but enough for someone outside to know where I was. The shape eventually left the window, but the footsteps continued around the cabin. Slow, deliberate, each step pressing deep into wet earth. Hours passed like that. Shapes outside, movement near the fence, the steady thudding on the wall that returned whenever everything else fell silent. I felt trapped inside the wooden box, unable to make a sound or move too quickly. The cold air thickened, and the smell of earth grew even heavier, as if something had been disturbed very recently outside. When dawn finally arrived, the storm had stopped. A pale gray light filled the cabin. I stood up with stiff legs and wiped the condensation from the window with my sleeve. The graveyard looked even older in the morning light. Some of the soil near the closest headstones looked freshly disturbed, the earth darker and clumped together in a way that didn't match the rest of the ground. I scanned the area near the cabin and saw deep footprints leading from the gate to the window, then around the back of the structure. The prints were smeared from the rain, but definitely human. Larger than my own. Heavier. I gathered my things immediately and stepped outside, keeping my eyes on the fence and the twisted path to the gate. The mud sucked at my boots, and the air smelled sharp and cold. When I reached my car, I felt a strong urge to check the cabin one more time, even though every instinct told me to leave. I turned around and looked at the wooden walls. That was when I noticed the marks. Along the back wall of the cabin, right where I had heard the steady thuds, long streaks ran down the wood. Not scratches, drag marks. Clean lines where mud-covered fingers had slid down the boards. 5 uneven lines, repeated several times, as if someone had leaned their weight against the wall and slowly dragged their hand downward again and again while I sat just a few feet away inside. A sick, heavy feeling spread through my stomach. I backed toward the car, got in, and locked the doors. My hands trembled as I turned the key and drove away from the cemetery without looking back again. By the time I reached the highway, the sky had brightened. People walked along the sidewalks of small towns, cars passed me, and everything felt normal again. But the image of those long drag marks stayed in my mind, clearer than anything else. Whoever had been outside that cabin wasn't trying to get in. They were waiting, watching, moving around the graveyard long before I arrived and long after I left. I never went back through that region again. Sometimes at night, when rain hits my windows, I still hear that steady thudding in my memory. Not loud, not fast, just patient. And I know that whatever I heard that night was real. Person. Someone living. Someone who moved between old graves and walked the cemetery path in the storm like it was their home. And knowing it was a real person made it far worse than anything supernatural ever could. It was the spring of 1998 when I decided to take a break from the city and build a small cabin in the mountains of western North Carolina. I was 28 at the time, restless, tired of concrete streets, constant noise, and the suffocating rhythm of 9-to-5 life. I had saved enough to buy a small plot of land, about 3 acres, nestled on the edge of a dense forest just off a winding dirt road that hardly saw traffic. The idea wasn't just to build a shelter, but to create a place where I could escape entirely, even if only for a weekend or two. I arrived in early March, when the trees were still bare and the soil was damp from the winter thaw. I wanted the cabin to be simple, roughly 15 by 20 feet, one room with a small loft for sleeping. I had learned basic carpentry from my grandfather when I was a kid, and I had spent months planning. I brought a modest set of tools, a chainsaw, a handsaw, a hammer, nails, screws, a drill, and a stack of rough lumber I had bought from a nearby mill. The first few days were exhausting. The ground was muddy, and it rained almost every afternoon. But there was something about the rhythm of working in the rain that I couldn't resist. My clothes would stick to me, boots caked in mud, hair damp and messy, but I felt alive in a way the city had never allowed. I started by clearing a flat area for the cabin, cutting down a few small trees, and dragging logs into position. The work was slow. Every log had to be stripped of branches, measured, cut, and leveled. I marked the corners carefully, dug post holes, and poured a crude concrete mix I had prepared, just enough to keep the structure from shifting. By the end of the first week, I had the floor frame assembled. I remember standing on it one evening, watching the rain beat down on the surrounding forest. The droplets ran along the logs, soaking into the wood, and the smell of wet pine filled the air. The sound of rain hitting the mud and leaves created a strange kind of peace. But there was also a tension I couldn't shake. The forest was alive in a way the city wasn't. Animals rustling, branches snapping, and the occasional distant howl of a coyote. At night, it felt as if the darkness itself was moving, pressing closer to the little clearing I had carved. I slept in my small tent the first few nights, huddled under a tarp, listening to the rain. One night, the storm came harder than usual. I had tied down the tent as best I could, but water seeped in, soaking my sleeping bag. I woke up in the middle of the night with mud on my face, shivering. The wind rattled the tarp, and I could hear the rain slapping the trees around me, the sound magnified in the darkness. I remember lying there, feeling utterly exposed, and realizing that the forest had its own rules. I wasn't in control here. Once the floor was secure, I started raising the walls. I used rough-sawn pine boards for the frame and nailed horizontal planks as cladding. Each plank had to be measured carefully, and every nail driven with precision, or the structure would be uneven. Rain slowed progress, soaking the wood and making the ground slippery. I had to be careful not to slip while carrying boards or balancing on uneven beams. There were moments when I thought about giving up, when the rain felt endless, but I kept going. I told myself it was just work, and work could be done even under miserable conditions. By the second week, the walls were standing, and the cabin began to feel like a real place. The rough smell of wet wood hung in the air. The rain had softened the soil so much that sometimes my boots sank halfway to my knees. I learned to plan my steps carefully, stepping on higher ground or logs to avoid the worst of the mud. One night, I found a fallen branch lodged against the wall, knocked loose by the wind. It had smashed a few planks, and I had to repair the damage in the pouring rain. My hands were raw from nails and splinters, my arms aching from lifting soaked boards, but I didn't stop. By the time I was done, I was soaked to the bone, mud dripping from my boots, hair plastered to my head, but the cabin was intact. The roof was the most challenging part. I cut beams from thicker logs and attached them across the walls, then covered them with plywood and tar paper I had brought from the city. It rained almost every day, and water would leak through the temporary covering, soaking the interior floor. I remember sitting on the floor one night, watching water collect in small puddles, realizing I had underestimated how much the rain could test my patience. But when the roof was finally secure, it felt like a triumph. For the first time, the cabin was dry inside. I could move around without slipping. I could leave my tools inside without worrying about rust, and the space began to feel like more than just wood nailed together. It was becoming a home. The small loft went up last. I used rough planks for the floor and created a makeshift railing for safety. It wasn't perfect, but it was functional. From the loft, I could see the forest canopy through gaps in the trees and watch the rain drip from branches onto the muddy ground below. There were nights when I lay up there, staring at the water-streaked sky, listening to the wind howl through the pines. Sometimes the storm was so loud that it felt as if the entire mountain was shaking. My hands would grip the edge of the loft, and I would remind myself that the cabin, my creation, was holding together. I spent hours clearing a small path to a nearby stream, where I collected water and rinsed off mud from the day's work. I stacked firewood carefully, cutting branches into manageable logs. I learned to cook simple meals on a small camping stove, the smell of frying onions and beans mixing with the wet pine in the air. Every night, I lit a small oil lamp in the cabin. The soft glow illuminated the rough wood, the scattered tools, and the small pile of firewood in the corner. The rain outside made the light feel warmer, safer. It took me nearly a month, working mostly alone and in the rain, but the cabin was finished. The walls were secure, the roof held tight, the loft was functional, and the floor was dry. I even built a small wooden chair and table, crude but usable. I stood in the doorway one evening, watching the last light of day filter through the clouds and the rain, feeling a strange mix of exhaustion and pride. The forest was still wild and imposing, the ground slick with mud, and the rain continued to fall, but inside, I had created a place that was mine. That night, I lit a fire in a small metal stove I had brought, and the warmth slowly pushed back the damp chill. I sat on the chair, watching the fire flicker, listening to the steady rhythm of rain on the roof. I realized that the fear I had felt alone in the forest, the isolation, the relentless storm, the feeling that the trees themselves were watching, had passed. I had endured the rain, the mud, the wind, and the exhaustion, and I had built something real. I wasn't just surviving. I was thriving in a way that the city could never offer. The next morning, the rain had stopped. Mist hung low over the forest, curling around tree trunks and the small cabin. The sun broke through in thin streaks, warming the wet ground. I stepped outside, boots squelching in the mud, and looked at what I had built. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't perfect, but it was mine and it had survived the storm. I felt a quiet satisfaction, a sense of accomplishment that didn't need applause or recognition. I had faced the rain, the forest, and the long, lonely nights, and I had come through. That cabin stayed with me for years, a small refuge in the mountains where I could escape, recharge, and remind myself that I was capable of more than I had believed. Every time I returned, I remembered those nights of relentless rain, the aching muscles, and the mud-streaked clothes, and I remembered the lesson the forest had quietly taught me, that even in the harshest conditions, persistence and care could create something lasting, something real, something worth protecting. I had been a park ranger for just over 3 years, mostly handling routine patrols and paperwork, nothing too exciting. The summer of 1998 had been unusually dry in the northern part of Colorado, and I was assigned to a remote section of the Rocky Mountain National Park, a place so secluded that even the locals rarely wandered near it. My station was a small, weathered cabin tucked into a pine-covered ridge, surrounded by steep slopes and the kind of forest that seemed untouched by time. The cabin had been built decades earlier, long before the park expanded into the area, and it had that distinct smell of old wood and pine sap that clung to every surface. I arrived just as the afternoon sun was dropping behind the mountains. The The sky was painted in streaks of orange and violet, and the air had that crisp, dry edge you only feel at high elevation. I parked my old Ford pickup near the cabin, the gravel crunching under the tires, and unloaded my gear. My German Shepherd, Brutus, trotted beside me, sniffing at every bush and tree as if he already knew this place belonged to him. I had spent weeks reading reports of minor wildlife disturbances and occasional hikers getting lost in the area, but nothing that made this assignment seem dangerous. The cabin itself was simple. One room with a wood stove, a small cot, a table, and a few shelves filled with old supplies left by previous rangers. The windows were dusty, and one had a crack running diagonally across the glass. I set down my backpack, unrolled my sleeping bag on the cot, and fired up the stove. The smell of burning wood mixed with the lingering scent of pine, and I felt a brief sense of comfort in the isolation. Brutus lay by the stove, his ears twitching at every small noise outside. By late evening, the forest had gone completely silent. The wind had died down, leaving only the occasional snap of a distant branch. I had eaten a small dinner of canned beans and bread, and I sat at the table jotting down notes for the next day's patrols. Outside, the darkness was dense, almost tangible, pressing against the cabin's walls. Brutus suddenly stiffened, his ears perked, and he let out a low growl. I froze, straining my eyes through the dim light of the stove. At first, I saw nothing, just shadows dancing among the trees. Then I noticed a flicker like the reflection of a flashlight moving between the trunks, too far for a hiker to be that late, too calculated for wildlife. I tried to convince myself it was just a lost hiker, maybe someone who had wandered off the trail, but the unease settled in my chest like a stone. I went to the door and peered out into the darkness. The beam of my own flashlight cut a narrow line through the night, and I swept it slowly across the clearing. Nothing, just the shadows of the tall pines, bending slightly in the breeze. Brutus growled again, low and warning, his hackles raised. I returned inside and locked the door, checking the windows to make sure they were secure. The cabin was small and sturdy, but it was still just wood and glass, nothing that could stop a determined intruder. My heart was beating faster now, and the silence outside felt thick, like the forest was holding its breath. I tried to focus on mundane thoughts, planning my patrol route, checking my gear, but every crackle of the stove and rustle of leaves made me jump. Brutus had moved closer to me, his body pressed against my leg, a silent anchor against the rising fear. Around midnight, I heard it, the faintest tapping, like someone running their fingers across the wooden siding of the cabin. My first instinct was to grab my radio, but the signal in this part of the park was weak. The tapping continued, sporadic, deliberate. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. Brutus barked sharply, and I saw movement in the shadow beyond the window, fast and fleeting. I shone the flashlight toward it, and the beam caught a glimpse of a figure darting behind a tree. My stomach sank. I knew this wasn't a lost hiker. This was someone or something watching, waiting. I considered leaving immediately, but the road to the cabin was rough, and with the darkness and my limited visibility, driving down the ridge was a risk I didn't want to take. I remembered the old hunting rifles in the cabin, left for emergency purposes. My hands shook as I loaded one, the metal cold and heavy in my grip. Brutus growled continuously, pacing by the door. I tried to calm myself, reminding myself that I had been trained for dangerous situations, that I could handle wildlife encounters, even armed trespassers. But this was different. This was personal. Hours passed. I didn't sleep. Every shadow seemed alive, every noise exaggerated in the stillness. At some point, the tapping stopped, replaced by silence so absolute it made my ears ring. I kept my rifle at the ready, every muscle tensed. By morning, the first light revealed nothing unusual. No footprints, no signs of forced entry, nothing to suggest that someone had been near the cabin. Only the crushed grass by the edge of the clearing hinted at movement during the night. Brutus was exhausted but alert, sniffing around and growling occasionally at spots where no one was there. The next day, I did a thorough patrol of the surrounding area, checking the perimeter and the nearby trails. I found faint footprints leading into the woods, not human-sized but elongated, like someone had been wearing boots designed for rough terrain. They disappeared as quickly as they appeared. It was unsettling, but I documented everything and reported it to the main ranger station. They told me it was probably a hunter or someone exploring off-limits areas, but the look in the dispatcher's eyes suggested they weren't entirely convinced. That night, I stayed alert again, keeping every light on and the rifle within reach. I noticed subtle changes around the cabin. Small rocks shifted at the edge of the clearing, a branch broken at just the right height to suggest someone had passed recently. Brutus refused to leave the door. He wouldn't eat, wouldn't lie down, just watched and waited. I realized I was feeling the same way. Paranoid, tense, but alive in a way that sharpened every sense. The final night passed without any direct encounter, but I knew the feeling of being watched hadn't gone. It had only retreated into the shadows, waiting. When my shift ended 2 weeks later, I packed up the cabin thoroughly, checking every lock and reinforcing the doors. As I drove down the winding dirt road, Brutus in the passenger seat, I looked back at the ridge and the cabin barely visible among the trees. I felt a mix of relief and unease, knowing I would probably never understand exactly what had been out there. But I also felt prepared, hardened, and grateful for my dog, who had kept me safe simply by sensing danger that I could barely comprehend. The park authorities later did an inspection of the cabin. They found nothing unusual, no sign of trespass, no evidence of break-in. Just the subtle disturbances that only someone who had spent nights alone in the forest could understand. Broken branches, moved rocks, and that intangible sense of being watched. I kept Brutus close for the rest of the summer, and we returned to more populated areas, but I never forgot that ridge or the nights spent in the cabin, where the forest itself seemed alive, observing, patient, and unpredictable. It wasn't supernatural. It wasn't a ghost. It was the raw, real tension of isolation, of being alone in the wilderness with someone or something watching just beyond the reach of the light. Years later, I sometimes drive past that ridge and glimpse the cabin tucked into the trees, silent and waiting. I never stay long. I know that whatever I encountered that summer is still out there, patient, hidden, and real, the kind of fear that doesn't need stories, legends, or supernatural explanations to be unforgettable. It was fear grounded in reality, the kind that makes you respect the wild, respect isolation, and trust your instincts, because sometimes, just sometimes, the forest does hold secrets you aren't meant to fully understand. It was the fall of 2013, and I decided to take a solo trip into the dense woods of northern Maine, bringing my German Shepherd, Rex, along. I had found a small cabin online that was advertised as remote, rustic, and surrounded by untouched forest. And for someone like me who had grown tired of city noise, it sounded perfect. The cabin itself was about 10 miles from the nearest paved road, and reaching it meant navigating through a rough dirt trail that twisted and turned among towering pine and maple trees. I was 28 at the time, and I'd grown up camping, but something about this place felt different even before I arrived. The drive there took longer than expected. The GPS signal kept dropping, forcing me to rely on old maps I had printed the night before. Rex sat in the passenger seat with his head out the window, ears flapping in the wind, occasionally letting out a low, wary growl whenever I slowed near tight bends. The sun was dipping low when I finally spotted the cabin. It was smaller than the pictures suggested, built from weathered logs that had darkened over decades, with a tin roof showing patches of rust. A thin trail of smoke rose lazily from the stone chimney, though no other signs of life were visible. Rex immediately perked up as I parked and jumped out, sniffing the ground and the air. The forest was eerily silent, except for the occasional rustle of leaves or distant call of a crow. It was that kind of silence that makes you hyper-aware of every sound. Your own heartbeat, the wind brushing through the trees, the snap of a branch. Inside, the cabin was modest but functional. A small wood stove sat in the corner, surrounded by a stack of split logs. There was a tiny kitchen area, a cot against the far wall, and a table with 2 chairs. Dust coated most surfaces, and the air smelled faintly of mold and old pine. I set down my pack, gave Rex a pat, and went about making a fire. The first few moments were comforting. The crackle of the stove, the orange glow filling the room, the warmth spreading. But as the shadows lengthened, the sense of isolation started to press in. I decided to explore a little before night fully fell. The cabin sat on a small clearing, surrounded on all sides by thick forest. To the east, a creek whispered as it wound its way through the trees. To the west, the terrain sloped slightly downward, and I could make out the dark shapes of old stumps and fallen logs. The further I wandered, the more I noticed subtle signs that I wasn't entirely alone. There were tracks in the soft earth near the creek. Not deer or bear, too small and oddly shaped, like someone had been walking on the balls of their feet. I checked Rex, and he was tense, ears high, body low, growling softly. Night came suddenly, faster than I expected. The forest changed instantly under the dark. The sounds of the creek became louder and sharper. The wind sounded like it was moving through the trees in waves, and every rustle seemed magnified. I went back to the cabin, double-checked that the doors and windows were secured, and settled by the fire. Rex curled at my feet, still alert, and I tried to calm my own nerves by focusing on simple tasks. Stacking more logs, filling the kettle, and eating the food I had brought. Around midnight, I heard it, a sound that made the blood drain from my face. It wasn't loud, but it carried a weight of intent. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, and careful, coming from somewhere just beyond the clearing. Rex stiffened instantly, ears forward, hackles rising. He growled low, a warning. My heart started hammering, but I forced myself to breathe, reminding myself it could be a deer or a raccoon. Yet, the rhythm of the steps didn't match anything I'd ever heard from wildlife. They were too measured, too patient. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped to the window, shining it into the darkness. Nothing, just the forest, shadowed and still, though the tracks I had seen earlier now seemed closer, leading directly to the cabin. My stomach churned. I thought about calling someone, but I had no signal, not a single bar. The isolation I had once craved now felt suffocating. The sound continued, circling the cabin. I could hear leaves crunching, small branches snapping. Then, a faint tap on the outer wall, metal against wood. My blood ran cold. I gripped a heavy log, ready to swing if needed. Rex leapt to the door, barking violently. The barking seemed to make the footsteps pause. Then I heard them retreat slowly into the darkness. For a while, the forest fell silent again, but the tension remained, palpable and unyielding. I didn't sleep much that night. Every creak of the cabin, every whisper of wind through the trees felt amplified. I stayed awake until dawn, watching the thin gray light filter through the pines. When the sun finally rose, I stepped outside, my hands shaking. There were more tracks around the cabin now, human footprints this time, unlike anything from the night before. They had come close enough to reach the front door. Whoever or whatever had been out there had circled the cabin, never stepping on the porch itself. I spent the day reinforcing the cabin as best I could. I piled extra logs in front of the door, jammed sticks into weak points, and cleared some of the surrounding brush to improve visibility. Rex never left my side. That night, the sounds returned, even bolder this time. Branches snapped closer, leaves rustled under deliberate steps, and a scratching came at the back door. I didn't move, just held Rex tightly, whispering calming words as he growled and bared his teeth. The noise persisted for hours, fading only when the first hints of morning light appeared. I realized then that I couldn't just sit and wait. I packed a small bag, leaving enough supplies for a day in case I had to flee. At first light, with Rex by my side, I started retracing my path back to the main road. Every sound in the forest put me on edge: birds taking flight, the snap of a twig underfoot, the rushing of the creek. At one point, I swear I saw a shadow moving in the distance, just beyond the tree line, but when I looked again, it was gone. By noon, I reached my car. The road was empty, silent in a way that still carried the memory of the night. I drove away slowly, glancing in the rearview mirror at the dark forest gradually disappearing behind me. I didn't look back again until I was safely in town. Later, when I told local rangers about the tracks and the sounds, they told me I had likely stumbled across a pair of illegal hunters or trappers who used that area for their own purposes. The careful steps, the circling, the avoidance of the cabin itself, it fit their methods. It wasn't supernatural, just human, but knowing that didn't make it any less terrifying. I was lucky. Rex's instincts, my caution, and a little bit of luck had kept us safe. That trip left a mark on me. I never went that remote again, and I always respected the forest's silence in a way I hadn't before. Rex stayed by my side for years after, and I could still see the alertness in his eyes, the memory of that night etched into his behavior as deeply as it was in mine. Some nights, even now, I dream about that cabin. The smell of wet pine, the cold shadows between the trees, the slow, deliberate footsteps circling just beyond the firelight. But those memories are also a reminder. Nature is beautiful, but isolation can be dangerous, and sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts, they're human. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. It was the spring of 2017, and I had decided to rent a small cabin in the Scottish Highlands for a week. My plan was simple: escape the constant noise of London, spend some quiet days walking through the hills, reading, and just being away from everything. I was 28 then, and I needed a break from my job, my apartment, and the city that never seemed to sleep. The cabin I found online seemed perfect. It was small, wooden, and tucked away at the end of a gravel path. The pictures showed a rustic but clean interior: a small kitchen, a wood stove, a single bedroom, and a tiny bathroom. The owner said it had no internet and no TV, which sounded perfect. I arrived in the late afternoon. The sun was low, painting everything in orange and gold. The air smelled of damp earth and pine. I had parked my car a short walk from the cabin and carried my bag along the narrow path that twisted through the trees. The first thing I noticed as I approached the cabin was how silent it was. Not just quiet, but empty. There was no wind, no birds, nothing. Even the trees seemed to stand still. I remember thinking it was peaceful, and at the same time, something felt off, though I couldn't put my finger on it. Inside, the cabin was exactly like the pictures. The wooden floor creaked under my feet. The furniture was old but well maintained. I unpacked slowly, taking my time to look around. Outside, the forest stretched endlessly, darkening as the sun sank behind the hills. I decided to take my dog, a golden retriever named Max, for a short walk before night fell. He was excited, running ahead, nose to the ground, tail wagging, ears flopping with every step. As we walked down a narrow path that led further into the woods, I noticed a figure standing just beyond a bend. At first, I thought it was another hiker, But as we got closer, I saw it was a woman. She was thin, maybe in her 60s, with long gray hair hanging in greasy strands down her back. Her clothes were ragged, and she wore a long coat that had seen better days. She didn't move. She just stood there, staring straight ahead. I felt a chill run down my spine. I called Max to stay, but he didn't notice her yet, sniffing the ground, unaware. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe she was lost, or maybe she lived in one of the cabins far deeper in the forest. But something about her posture made me uneasy. She was too still, too rigid, like she was waiting for something. I decided to turn around and head back to the cabin. Max followed me without complaint, though he shot a glance over his shoulder at the woman. From the cabin, I tried to shake off the unease. I prepared a simple dinner, a sandwich, and a thermos of tea. The woods outside the window were now completely dark, shadows moving in the corners where the moonlight barely reached. I tried to read, but my mind kept drifting to the woman I had seen. Around 10, I decided to check the perimeter of the cabin. I grabbed a flashlight and Max's leash and went outside. The night was colder than I expected. The fog had rolled in, hugging the ground, curling around the trees. I walked slowly around the cabin, shining the light across the undergrowth. Nothing, no sign of her. I felt a little relief but kept my instincts alert. That night, sleep was uneasy. Every creak of the cabin, every whisper of wind through the trees made me tense. Max, usually a deep sleeper, was alert, growling softly in his sleep. I kept telling myself I was imagining things, that there was no reason to be afraid. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next morning, I decided to explore further, trying to convince myself the previous day was just paranoia. I packed a small bag, brought Max, and took a path that led down to a small creek. The sun was out now, and the forest seemed almost cheerful.
Beurre sans, insecte buzzed.
Everything felt normal, and for a moment, I relaxed. Then I saw her again. She was crouched near the creek, her coat muddy, her hands in the water. She didn't look at me, didn't react. I froze, unsure what to do. Max tugged at the leash, sensing my tension. I thought about calling out, but my voice would only startle her. Instead, I turned slowly, walking back toward the cabin. My stomach twisted in knots. Over the next few days, I kept seeing her. Sometimes in the distance, sometimes closer than I would have liked. Always silent, always watching. The cabin, once a haven, started to feel like a trap. I kept checking locks, making sure windows were secure, keeping Max close at all times. The feeling of being watched never left me, even when I was inside. On the fourth day, I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside. Heavy, slow, deliberate. My heart raced. I grabbed Max's leash and went to the door. The fog was thick, almost blinding. I could see the shape of someone moving, and my stomach sank. It was her again. This time, she was right at the edge of the cabin's clearing. I stayed quiet, trying to stay calm. Then I noticed her hands. They were dirty, but she was holding a small bundle wrapped in rags. I couldn't see what it was, but the way she clutched it, protectively, set every nerve on edge. Max growled low, his hackles raised. She didn't approach, didn't make a sound. Then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, she turned and walked slowly into the fog, disappearing from view. I realized then that I had to leave. The peaceful retreat I had imagined was gone. I packed my things quickly, making sure Max had food and water for the trip. I double-checked the cabin, locked everything, and started the walk back to my car. Every step felt heavier than the last. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see her again. But she never appeared. The drive back to the main road was tense. I kept the windows up, the doors locked. When I finally reached a small town and stopped for petrol, I let out the breath I didn't realize I had been holding. I reported the incident to the local authorities. explaining what I had seen. They listened carefully, took notes, but told me there wasn't much they could do without more information. They said that sometimes people, often older, choose to live in the woods, away from everyone. They called them recluses and said encounters like mine, while unsettling, were not uncommon. I returned to London that evening, feeling both relieved and shaken. The cabin, the woods, the woman, they stayed with me for a long time. I never found out who she was or what she was doing with that bundle. But over time, I realized that the fear I felt was not about ghosts or monsters, but about real life. The unpredictability of people, the sense that someone could be there, silent, observing, and we would have no idea why. Years later, I would think back to that trip often. I never went back to that cabin, and I never went to the Highlands alone again. But I also realized something important. Fear doesn't always need a storybook explanation. Sometimes, it's simply the awareness that the world is full of people we don't understand, and the unknown can be just as frightening as anything imagined. Max passed away a few years after that trip, and I often think about him too, how he sensed danger before I did. I still tell people the story, but I never embellish. The woman in the woods was real, and the fear I felt was real. But the ending, at least for me, was clear. We got out alive. No one was hurt. No one was trapped. Just a moment in the forest that reminded me how careful we need to be, and how quickly things can shift from calm to tense, from safe to unsettling. I remember the trip like it was yesterday, though it happened back in 2003. I was 28 at the time, young enough to think I was invincible, but old enough to know better. I had been hunting since I was a teenager, mostly deer and the occasional wild turkey, and I usually went with friends. This time, I went alone. I wanted the quiet, the solitude, and the chance to push myself in the backcountry. I picked a remote part of northern Idaho, miles from the nearest road or trail. The cabin I had rented for the week sat on the edge of a small clearing, surrounded by dense pine and fir trees, the kind that blocked the sky so completely that even midday felt like twilight. The first day was uneventful. I drove my old pickup down a gravel road until it disappeared into mud and ruts, then hiked the last mile with my pack, the rifle slung over my shoulder. The cabin was small, log-built, probably from the 70s, with a rusty wood stove and a few old cots. The windows were thick with grime, and the front door's lock had a jagged gap that made it hard to secure. Still, it had a certain charm, the kind that made you feel like you'd stumbled into a place untouched for decades. I set my gear down, unloaded my pack, and stacked firewood by the stove. The first night, the wind rattled the roof, and every snap of a branch outside made me start. But that was normal. I'd spent enough nights in the woods to know that. The second day, I went further into the forest. I spotted a buck, a big one, and I followed its tracks into a canyon. I didn't shoot, partly because I didn't want to waste my first day of hunting, but mostly because the place felt off. The silence was too deep, almost suffocating. Birds were scarce, and even the small sounds of insects were muffled. By late afternoon, I made my way back to the cabin. The trail was harder to find in the dim light, and I kept thinking I was hearing footsteps behind me. I'd stop, and of course there was nothing. Just the wind, I told myself. That night, I stayed up later than usual, cleaning my rifle and eating canned beans over the stove. Around midnight, I heard it. At first I thought it was the wind, but then the sound repeated, deliberate. A soft thud against the cabin wall. Not one, but a few, spaced irregularly, like someone was testing the structure, trying to see if it was empty. My heart raced. I double-checked the door, even jammed a firewood log under the handle. Then I sat in the shadows, listening. The sound stopped after a few minutes, but I didn't sleep well. The next morning, I found signs that made my blood run cold. Tracks in the thin layer of frost near the cabin, human, adult male, heavy boots. I hadn't seen anyone else on the trail the day before, and there was no road access nearby. Whoever it was, they had been circling the cabin while I was out hunting. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like a rabbit in the open. I spent the day hunting in a wider radius, but my shots were nervous, my focus off. By afternoon, I returned to the cabin, checking the perimeter carefully. Nothing. No footprints leading away, no signs of campfires or other hunters. That night, I decided to lock myself in. I piled firewood against the door and stayed up with the rifle across my lap. Around 2 in the morning, the noises returned. This time, it wasn't just a thud against the wall. Something was dragging across the ground outside, slow and deliberate, moving in a circle around the cabin. I could hear it scrape against stones and twigs snapping under heavy weight. My stomach dropped. Whoever or whatever it was, they knew I was here. I didn't sleep at all that night. By dawn, I had made a plan. I couldn't stay there another night. I packed my things silently, careful not to make a sound. As I opened the door, I froze. Fresh footprints, larger than mine, surrounded the cabin. They didn't lead directly to the forest. They formed a rough circle, stopping right at the edge of the clearing. I counted 3 sets, maybe more, and all were too large for normal hiking boots and too heavy to be deer prints. My skin crawled. I ran down the narrow trail toward my truck, heart hammering, eyes darting to every shadow. The forest seemed denser, the trees closing in, branches grabbing at my jacket. I stumbled, scraped my hands on bark, but I kept running. When I finally broke out onto the gravel road, I saw it. My truck door was open. Tire tracks around it suggested someone had been there, pacing, waiting. I gritted my teeth, checking the bed. Nothing was stolen, nothing broken, just the open door. Whoever had been circling the cabin was gone now, but I knew they had been close, too close. I jumped in, locked every door, and drove as fast as the road would allow, the truck bouncing over ruts and gravel. Behind me, the forest seemed unnaturally quiet, like it had been holding its breath. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, a tiny place called Priest River. I pulled into the first gas station, shaking, trying to make sense of what had happened. The clerk looked at me like I'd grown a second head when I asked if anyone had been on the roads near the forest. "Nothing for days," he said. "You're lucky no one got to you." I never went back to that cabin. Weeks later, I researched the area and found reports of similar encounters, though sparse. Hunters and hikers had vanished or found footprints circling their campsites. Nothing official, just stories buried in old forums and local papers. I never saw anyone in person, never heard from anyone else who had been there, but the memory stuck with me. Even now, over 20 years later, I remember the smell of wet pine, the way frost crackled under boots, and the way I felt like someone or something was watching from just beyond the trees. Looking back, I realized that my mistake was underestimating how isolated that place was. You think the forest is quiet because it's peaceful, but sometimes it's quiet because no one else survives long enough to make noise. I still hunt, but I avoid cabins in the deep backcountry now, and I keep a careful eye on tracks, even the ones that seem to appear out of nowhere. You never know who or what might be circling, waiting just beyond sight. The trip taught me something vital. Wilderness is unforgiving, but people can be worse. The cabin was a trap, not built by ghosts or fairy tale monsters, but by circumstance and the hidden presence of someone or a few people who had been lurking in the shadows. The clear ending for me was surviving and learning to respect the isolation. I made it out alive, and that night, safe in a motel far from the forest, I realized I would never take the backcountry for granted again. The fear never fully left me, but it became a caution, a tool to survive. Even now, when I drive through northern Idaho, I see that same dense forest, the same shadowed pines, and I shiver. Not from ghosts, not from imagination, but from knowing that sometimes you're never really alone in the woods. It was the summer of 2007, and I was 24, restless and looking for something that would break the monotony of my life in Boise, Idaho. I had been working long hours at a small hardware store, stocking shelves and fixing doors, and the constant sameness had started gnawing at me. I decided one Saturday morning that I needed to escape into the mountains for a day, or maybe two, something that would feel like real solitude. I grabbed my backpack, packed some water, a few cans of beans, a flashlight, a small first aid kit, and my old hunting knife, and headed north toward the Sawtooth Range. I had heard rumors of a small, abandoned cabin somewhere along a ridge past Redfish Lake, left from the 1930s, mostly forgotten. No one hiked that trail much, and the few who did mostly returned with stories about how creepy the place felt. That was exactly the kind of thing I wanted, remoteness and a bit of an edge. I parked my truck at the trailhead around 9 in the morning and started the climb. The air was crisp, scented with pine and the lingering cold of the night, and the sun was just high enough to burn the morning mist off the mountainside. The hike took longer than I had expected. The trail was narrow, overgrown in parts, with fallen trees blocking my path, forcing me to scramble over roots slick with moss. Birds called somewhere above me, and the occasional rustle in the underbrush made me tense, though I kept reminding myself it was just squirrels or deer. About 4 hours in, after a particularly steep incline, I spotted it, half hidden behind a stand of fir trees. The cabin. It looked worse than I had imagined. The roof sagged in the middle, the wooden planks that made up the walls were warped and splintered, and the front porch had mostly collapsed. The windows were dark, many of them broken, jagged glass clinging to the frames. I stepped closer, my boots crunching on the dry needles and dead leaves that littered the forest floor. The closer I got, the more I noticed the details. The way the door was slightly off its hinges, swinging just a little in the wind, the way the chimney leaned unnaturally to the side, and the smell, sharp and earthy, of old wood rotting from the inside. I circled the cabin slowly, examining it. There were signs someone had been there more recently than I expected. A few footprints pressed into the dirt leading around the side, and near the back, a pile of ashes that looked old but not entirely cold. I tried to piece together who might have used it and when. Poachers? Hikers like me? The forest seemed to swallow the place whole, hiding it from casual view, which made me feel both excited and uneasy. Eventually, I decided to step inside. The door creaked loudly on its hinges, and I had to push it with my shoulder to get it open. The interior smelled of damp wood and mold, a scent that clung to my clothes almost immediately. Dust motes hung in the shafts of sunlight that filtered through the broken windows, and the floorboards groaned under my weight. There was a table in the middle of the main room, its surface coated in decades of grime, and a rusted metal stove against one wall. A broken chair lay on its side in the corner, its legs splintered. I moved carefully, making sure each step was deliberate. The cabin was small, just one room and a tiny loft above, which I guessed had once served as a sleeping area. I climbed up the ladder to the loft. The boards were thin and weak, and one of them cracked under my foot with a loud snap, sending a shiver down my spine. I froze for a moment, listening. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, the occasional snap of a distant branch, but nothing else. I made my way back down, relieved. I spent some time exploring the immediate surroundings. Behind the cabin, there was a small clearing, overgrown now, but I could see faint traces of an old garden. Rows where someone had once planted vegetables, now just weeds and grass. A rusted tin can lay half-buried near what used to be a fire pit. Something about it made me pause. It wasn't just abandoned. It felt as though it had been left in a hurry, or at least left to decay slowly over time. I kept thinking I could feel the presence of someone else, though I knew logically it was just my imagination. As the afternoon wore on, the sky began to darken with clouds I hadn't noticed before. The wind picked up, rattling the remaining window panes, and I realized that I hadn't paid much attention to the time. If I stayed too long, I'd have to make the climb back in the dark. I decided to gather my things and leave, but when I went to step outside, I froze. On the ground near the porch, there were fresh footprints. They led straight to the cabin and stopped at the door. My heart pounded. Someone had been here recently, maybe even today. I tried to calm myself. Maybe it was another hiker. I couldn't hear anything. No voices, no movement. I didn't want to stick around to find out. I grabbed my pack and moved quickly, heading back down the trail. The wind was louder now, whistling through the trees, carrying a faint chill that made me pull my jacket tighter. Every snap of a branch or rustle of leaves made me flinch. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me, but there was no one. By the time I reached my truck, the sun was low, casting long shadows across the parking lot. I climbed in, locked the doors, and sat there for a few minutes, trying to calm down. My hands were shaking, my heart still racing. I kept thinking about the cabin, the emptiness, the sense that someone could have been watching me the entire time. I didn't stay long enough to see, and in retrospect, that was probably for the best. On the drive back to Boise, I kept replaying every detail in my mind. The leaning chimney, the broken windows, the footprints inside and outside the cabin. I realized I had gotten lucky, not with any supernatural force, but with the randomness of human behavior. If someone had been nearby and had been inclined toward harm, I could have been in serious trouble. The fear I felt wasn't about ghosts or monsters. It was about the very real possibility of running into another human being who didn't mean me well, in a place where no one would hear me scream. The memory of that day stayed with me. I went back to the cabin once, a few months later, with proper gear and a friend, and we found it exactly the same, decaying, empty, dangerous. But that first time alone was the one that haunted me, not because of anything supernatural, but because of how real it all felt. A tiny structure in the middle of a dense forest, left to the elements, but capable of holding secrets and danger. I never saw anyone there, never heard anyone, but I knew the traces of another human presence were enough to make me realize just how isolated and vulnerable we are in the wilderness. The cabin is still out there, off the trail, hidden by trees and time. I think about it often when I hike in the mountains. It's a reminder that fear doesn't need ghosts, and danger doesn't need monsters. It's in the real, quiet things, the footsteps you don't recognize, the wind that seems to whisper, the sense that someone or something else is just out of sight. And that's why, even years later, I stick to trails and carry my knife and flashlight, and why I never, ever go into abandoned cabins alone anymore. It was the winter of 2007 when I decided to take a break from the city. I was 24, burned out from endless hours of work at a small accounting firm in Chicago, and craving solitude. I remembered a small cabin I had rented the previous summer from an online listing. Rustic, isolated, and surrounded by dense forests near the edge of northern Wisconsin. At the time, I had gone with a friend, but this trip I wanted alone time, away from everything. The drive up was long, stretching through miles of snow-covered roads, the gray sky heavy with clouds that threatened to drop more snow at any moment. My old pickup rattled over the icy pavement, its engine grumbling like it wasn't sure it wanted to make it. The cabin itself sat at the end of a thin, winding dirt road, practically swallowed by towering pine and spruce trees. From the outside, it was nothing special, just a square wooden structure with a pitched roof and a small porch. But the isolation was exactly what I wanted. I pulled up to the cabin, shivering as the cold hit me in waves the moment I stepped out of the truck. I grabbed my bag and flashlight and fumbled with the keys. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of wood smoke and something older, like damp wool or mildew. The place was sparsely furnished. A small wood-burning stove, a worn couch, a couple of chairs, and a kitchen table with a few plates and mugs. There were 2 bedrooms upstairs and a bathroom tucked into the corner. I unpacked slowly, appreciating the silence, the way the wind whistled outside like it was pushing against the walls of the cabin. The first night was uneventful, or so I thought. I slept poorly, waking often at the sound of the wind scraping branches against the roof. When I woke in the morning, the snow had fallen heavily, blanketing everything outside in an almost blinding white. I decided to go for a short walk to stretch my legs and check the surroundings. The forest was silent except for the crunch of snow under my boots. I noticed something then: faint footprints leading from the edge of the tree line to the cabin. They didn't look like animal tracks. They were too wide, too deep, as though someone had trudged through the snow recently. I froze, scanning the tree line, but the snow was falling fast now, quickly covering any other tracks. I shook my head and told myself I was imagining it. Maybe a local hunter had come by. By evening, the wind had grown stronger, and the sky darkened earlier than I expected. I lit the stove and made some tea, sitting near the small window and watching the snow swirl past. That's when I first noticed it: the light outside the window. At first, I thought it was a reflection from the stove, but the flickering, uneven movement made me look closer. Across the clearing, at the edge of the trees, a faint glow moved slowly. It wasn't steady like a flashlight. It flickered, as though someone was walking with a lantern. I felt my heart race. The road to the cabin was long and treacherous, and no one should be coming here at night, not in this weather. I told myself to stay calm and went to check the doors and windows. Everything was locked, though the locks themselves were old and rattled if I pushed too hard. I double-checked the stove door, then retreated to the couch, trying to focus on the tea, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The cabin's walls felt thin. Each creak and groan of the wood sounded louder than it should have. That night, I barely slept. Every few hours, I'd wake to some sound outside: a branch snapping, the faint crunch of snow, or that flickering light appearing again, moving slowly along the tree line. The next day, I stayed inside, chopping wood and trying to keep myself busy. The snowstorm had worsened, making the forest almost impossible to navigate. At one point, I ventured just a few feet beyond the cabin to clear a path, and that's when I saw it. Footprints, larger than mine, circling the cabin in the fresh snow. They weren't human, at least not entirely. They were wider, more uneven, like someone wearing heavy boots dragging through the snow. Panic started to build, but I reminded myself there could be a logical explanation. Maybe a hunter or someone who lost their way in the storm. I didn't want to believe it could be anything else. By evening, the storm had turned the cabin into a small island in a sea of white. The power lines were buried under snow, though the cabin had a small generator. I kept it running, the low hum offering some comfort. Around midnight, the snow stopped, leaving a heavy, oppressive silence. That's when the sound started, scraping along the walls, low and deliberate, like someone trying to get in. I stayed frozen, straining to hear over my own shallow breathing. Then I heard another sound, a heavy thump on the roof, followed by a scraping along the eaves. My heart hammered. I grabbed the largest knife from the kitchen and kept it by my side, watching the windows. The flickering light was back, just beyond the tree-line, moving closer, slowly. I realized then that I had no way to call for help. My cell phone had no signal, and the snowstorm had cut off the road. I thought about staying calm, keeping quiet, but the thought of someone, or something, outside was suffocating. I decided to make a plan. If the figure tried to enter, I'd block the door with the table and chairs and stay upstairs. I also started checking every window, making sure they were locked as best as possible. Hours passed like this. Every small sound sent me jumping, every shadow in the flickering light outside making me flinch. Morning came finally, gray and heavy, the wind still whispering through the trees. I gathered courage and stepped outside, my knife in hand. The footprints around the cabin were gone, completely erased by fresh snow. No one had been there, but I noticed something else. Tracks leading away from the cabin into the deeper forest, wide and deep, and then abruptly stopping. The flickering light had disappeared. The entire night, someone had been outside, moving around, circling, watching me. I had no idea who or why, and the emptiness of the tracks left me feeling both relieved and unsettled. I stayed one more night, not daring to sleep on the main floor. I spent it upstairs, huddled under blankets, knife in hand, flashlight ready. In the morning, I packed everything quickly. The drive back through the snow-covered roads was tense. Every sound from the trees, every rustle made me flinch. I told myself it could have been a hunter, someone local, but deep down, I knew it didn't feel right. There was something deliberate in the way the footprints had circled the cabin, in the way the light had moved. When I finally got back to the city, I called the cabin owner. They confirmed the place had been empty all winter. No other renters, no staff. I tried to put it behind me, but even years later, I still think about it. I've returned to northern Wisconsin, but never that area, never that cabin. Sometimes, late at night, I imagine the flickering light at the edge of the forest, moving slowly, deliberately, and the memory makes me shiver. The cabin wasn't haunted by ghosts, nor was it anything supernatural. But that night, it had been very, very real, and I was not alone. It was the autumn of 1998 when I finally made the trip back to my grandmother's cabin in the woods of northern Maine. The trees had already started turning, their leaves blazing in shades of red and gold, and the air carried the crisp smell of fallen leaves and damp earth. I hadn't been there in nearly 15 years, not since my grandmother, Edna, had started slowing down and moving into assisted living closer to town. But now, with her gone, I had to sort out her cabin and gather what I could before it fell into ruin. I remember driving up the narrow, winding dirt road, my old Jeep rattling against rocks and roots that had pushed through the surface. The cabin appeared at the end of the path like it had been waiting for me, half hidden by overgrown shrubs and tall grass. Its wooden exterior had weathered to a dull gray, and the roof sagged slightly in the middle, though it looked sturdy enough. I parked, took a deep breath of the cold air, and stepped out, feeling the crunch of leaves under my boots. My dog, Max, a large black Labrador, leapt out beside me, tail wagging, sensing something in the air that I couldn't yet name. The door was locked as I expected, but with the key my grandmother had given me years ago, it swung open with a groan. Inside, the air was heavy, thick with dust and that unmistakable smell of abandonment mixed with decay. Sunlight barely reached the corners of the main room through the grimy windows. I set my bag down and called Max over, trying to shake off the creeping unease that had settled over me as soon as I stepped inside. The cabin was small, just a main living area with a kitchen in one corner, a narrow hallway, and 2 bedrooms. The living room smelled faintly of cedar, which mingled oddly with the scent of old wood and mildew. I walked carefully, scanning the furniture my grandmother had left behind. Her favorite rocking chair sat near the fireplace, its cushions faded and threadbare. On the shelves were stacks of old books, jars of dried herbs, and photographs in crooked frames. Everything seemed frozen in time, as though she had simply stepped out for a moment and might return any second. Then I saw it, her body. At first, I thought it was just a pile of blankets or clothes crumpled in the corner of her bedroom. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized it was her. She was lying on the floor next to the bed, her face pale and expressionless, her hands resting stiffly on her chest. The room felt suddenly smaller, colder. I could hear my own heartbeat thumping in my ears. I swallowed hard and took a step closer, noticing the details. Her skin had taken on that waxy tone that only appears after death. Her hair spread like a halo on the floor, and her breath, or lack of it, was deafening in the silence. I called her name quietly at first, and then louder, as if shouting could make her wake up. Max growled low in his throat, nudging my hand with his wet nose, but even he seemed tense, his ears pinned back. I checked for a pulse, though deep down I already knew the answer. My grandmother had passed quietly, maybe even peacefully, but the shock hit me like a punch. For a long while I just stood there, staring. The cabin, usually a place of warmth and memories, now felt hollow and menacing. The air was thick and still, and outside, the wind rustled the dying leaves in a way that sounded almost like whispers. I felt a wave of guilt and helplessness crash over me. How had she ended up here alone? Why hadn't anyone checked in sooner? I moved slowly, trying to process the situation while respecting her. I didn't want to disturb anything more than necessary. I wrapped her gently in a blanket I found on the bed and laid her on the bed with as much dignity as I could manage. The cabin, quiet and abandoned, seemed to hold its breath with me, waiting for me to decide what to do next. The phone lines were long gone, so I had no way to call anyone from the cabin. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the road back to town was rough. I had to drive there to get help. I kept Max close as I stepped outside, the cold air biting at my face. The sun had started to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the yard. I loaded my grandmother's old pickup truck with a few essentials in case I needed them, then climbed into my Jeep with Max beside me and made the slow drive back to town. At the sheriff's office, they were professional but kind. They confirmed what I already knew. My grandmother had likely passed in her sleep a few days ago. They explained the next steps: the medical examiner, paperwork, contacting relatives. The reality of it was brutal, and I felt the weight of responsibility press down on me, heavy and unrelenting. I spent the next few days at the cabin, preparing it as best I could. I cleaned, organized, and sorted her belongings. Each drawer, each shelf, revealed pieces of her life. Letters, photographs, handmade quilts, old receipts from trips I had long forgotten. In a way, it felt like reconnecting with her, piecing together memories as I moved slowly through the tasks. Max was my constant companion, guarding the cabin, lying at my feet, and keeping me company in the silence. As I worked, I started noticing details I hadn't before. A stack of neatly folded towels on the bathroom counter, her knitting basket by the chair, a jar of pickles she had made last summer. It was comforting, in a strange way, to see the life she had built here, even if it was now ended. I realized that the cabin wasn't just a house. It was her life made tangible, each item a testament to years of quiet, steadfast living. Finally, the day came when the cabin was ready to be handed over to the authorities for whatever next step was needed. I stood outside, looking at the small wooden structure, now almost serene in the late afternoon light. I ran my hand over the weathered railing, feeling the grooves and knots, imagining my grandmother standing there in the morning sun, watering plants, sipping tea, humming quietly. Max nudged my hand, and I patted him, feeling a sense of closure settle in. I left the cabin that day with a mixture of sorrow and peace. Sorrow for the loss of the woman who had been my anchor, but peace in knowing I had honored her memory, faced the reality without flinching, and preserved the dignity she deserved. The woods behind the cabin whispered in the wind, but it no longer felt menacing. It felt like the natural rhythm of life continuing, even in the face of death. Driving back down the long dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror at the cabin, shrinking behind the trees, and I felt a deep, quiet understanding. Life was fragile and fleeting, but memory and respect could hold it in place for a little while longer. I promised myself I would return, keep her spirit alive in small ways, tending the yard, keeping the path clear, and remembering the tiny details of her life that made the cabin hers. And though I would never see her again in the living world, I knew she had left me something more lasting than her physical presence. The courage to face hard truths, the patience to handle sorrow, and the quiet, stubborn endurance to carry on. It was the spring of 2017, early May, when I started my solo shift at the small ranger station tucked deep in the mountains of western Montana. I was 28 at the time, fresh out of seasonal training, and had taken the posting at Blackwood Ridge, a remote area known more for its dense forests and jagged cliffs than for visitors. The cabin itself was modest, made of dark timber, with a creaky wooden porch and a slanted metal roof that rattled when the wind picked up. Electricity was limited to a generator that hummed faintly in the corner, and water came from a small spring-fed pump outside. I arrived late in the afternoon, my old Jeep crunching over the gravel road that wound through towering pines. The smell of wet earth and decaying leaves hit me the moment I stepped out. My dog, a scrappy border collie named Sam, bounded ahead, sniffing at the underbrush and barking at some invisible disturbance. Sam had been with me for 4 years and never missed a beat when it came to sensing danger, or at least when it came to noticing things I couldn't see yet. The first night, everything was normal. I lit a small kerosene lamp inside the cabin, cooked a simple dinner, and checked the weather on the old hand-crank radio. Blackwood Ridge was famous for sudden storms, but that night, the sky was clear. Sam lay at my feet, eyes half closed but ears twitching, and I felt that familiar mixture of isolation and freedom I always loved about the wilderness. It was the second night that things started to feel off. I had been outside checking the perimeter, flashlight in hand, when I noticed fresh tire tracks in the mud, a set that didn't belong to any of the rangers. They were recent, deep, and headed toward the North Ridge, disappearing into the dense undergrowth. I froze for a moment, trying to rationalize it. Perhaps hikers, poachers, or illegal hunters passing through. But there had been no calls or alerts from headquarters, and no vehicles were supposed to be in that area. I went back to the cabin, keeping my eyes on the forest, but I didn't say a word to Sam. I didn't want to worry him, even if he was already alert. By the third night, I was on edge. A heavy rain had started in the late evening, turning the dirt road to slick mud and drumming on the metal roof like a constant warning. Sam was unusually restless, pacing near the door and growling at shadows that didn't seem real. Around midnight, I heard it, a low, scraping sound outside, like metal being dragged over rock. My first instinct was to check the generator, thinking it might be a maintenance tool left behind, but everything was in order. I shined the flashlight through the rain at the treeline. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure crouched low, just beyond the edge of the porch light. It vanished as soon as I blinked, leaving nothing but shadows and the rhythmic hammering of rain. The fourth day, I decided to investigate properly. I put on my heavy rain jacket, boots, and grabbed the rifle from the wall mount. Sam trailed close, his fur soaked, but his eyes sharp. I followed the tracks from the night before, trudging through thick mud and under low-hanging branches. It was difficult terrain, the forest floor slick and uneven, roots snaking like veins across the ground. The tracks led me deeper than I had ever gone before, to an old fire lookout that had been abandoned for years. The cabin was rotting, windows smashed, and the scent of mold and wetwood made me gag. But the tracks didn't stop there. They continued past the lookout, into a narrow ravine where the forest grew almost impossibly thick. I turned back at that point. The light was fading, and I didn't want to get lost in the wilderness at night. But as I retraced my steps, I felt a growing pressure in the air, a sense that I was being watched. Sam's growl became constant, low and guttural. When I glanced back, I caught movement, something slipping behind the trees, moving too fast and too fluidly to be just a person. I could see its outline only briefly, tall, hunched, and cautious, as if it knew I would notice if it made a mistake. That night, in the cabin, I barely slept. The rain had stopped, leaving a cold, damp fog that crept through the forest like it had a purpose. Around 2 a.m., I heard scratching at the door. It wasn't loud, but it was deliberate. Someone or something was testing the lock. Sam was barking now, and I grabbed the rifle, moving quietly to the door. I didn't open it. Instead, I shone my flashlight through the small window. There was a figure, humanoid, hunched, watching me. Its face was obscured by a hood, and I couldn't make out its features. It didn't leave immediately. It stood there for minutes, silently, before stepping back into the fog. I spent the next morning boarding up the windows as best I could, checking that the generator had fuel and ensuring Sam had water and food. I called headquarters on the radio, reporting strange activity and requesting backup. The line crackled, confirming my coordinates, and said a ranger team would be sent in the next day. That night, I barely slept again, listening to every branch snap, every distant animal cry. Sam stayed close, refusing to leave my side. By the 5th day, the backup arrived, a team of 3 rangers in a muddy SUV. When I showed them the tracks, the abandoned lookout, and the spot in the ravine, they were as unsettled as I was. One of them, a veteran named Harris, studied the tracks and murmured, "Not a hiker, not any animal I know." They stayed the night with me, keeping watch in shifts. The figure didn't appear again, at least not directly, but we all felt it, moving silently, observing from a distance. By morning, the team found tire tracks leading away from the area, heading into another forested section of the park. Harris suspected an illegal operation, perhaps poaching, maybe smuggling, but without evidence, it was impossible to confirm. They took over patrol of the area, and I finally left Blackwood Ridge, my relief mixed with unease. Even after returning home, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched whenever I drove along quiet, wooded roads. Years later, in 2021, I returned to Blackwood Ridge for a hiking trip, curious if anything had changed. The cabin was still standing, though weathered and leaning slightly, the forest reclaiming its edges. I followed the old tracks, the same path I had walked before, and saw the remnants of the old lookout. The place was quiet, too quiet, but there was no sign of anyone, or anything, hunting the woods. Whatever it was that had haunted those nights, it had either moved on or learned to avoid human eyes completely. I left the forest that day with a strange mix of relief and lingering fear. I never discovered exactly what had been following me or why, but the experience taught me to respect the wilderness in a new way. The mountains were beautiful, but they were also dangerous, and they held secrets that no amount of training could fully prepare you for. Sam, still my loyal companion, seemed unconcerned by my memories, but I knew he had sensed it all long before I did. In the end, the only thing I could control was my vigilance and my instinct, and that was enough to get me out alive. I remember it like it was yesterday, even though it's been years. It was the summer of 2014, and I had just turned 27. I decided to take a solo trip out to northern Arizona, far into the high desert, to disconnect from the city and spend a few days alone hiking and camping. I'd rented a small cabin from a guy named Hank, an older man who lived in a nearby town called Pinedale. The cabin was old, wooden, and tucked away behind a sparse grove of juniper and pinyon pines. Hank assured me it was off the grid, which was exactly what I wanted. The drive out was long, bumpy, and dusty. My old pickup rattled with every pothole, but the sun was bright, the air dry, and the mountains looked like they had been painted onto the horizon. By the time I arrived, the sun was dipping low, casting a golden glow over the landscape. The cabin sat alone on a slight rise, surrounded by brush and scrub, with no other houses or roads in sight. I parked, grabbed my pack, and unlocked the door. Inside, it smelled faintly of wood smoke and dust. The furniture was simple: a small table, 2 chairs, a twin bed, and a gas stove. A stack of firewood sat by the fireplace, and an old lantern hung from a hook on the wall. The first night was quiet, almost unnervingly so. The wind rustled the trees outside, but there were no other sounds. No cars, no animals, nothing but the occasional creak of the cabin itself. I unpacked, built a small fire, and settled in with some food I'd brought. My dog, Max, a medium-sized shepherd mix, stayed close to me, his ears flicking at every little noise. Around midnight, I woke to a low, guttural sound outside. At first, I thought it was an animal, a coyote maybe, but it was different. It was heavier, deliberate. I strained my ears. Max growled softly, his hackles raised, staring at the window. The noise stopped as quickly as it started. I chalked it up to nerves and went back to sleep, but that was the first hint that something wasn't right. The next day, I decided to hike down to a dry creek bed about a mile from the cabin. The sun was hot, the air dry, and the landscape was harsh but beautiful. I took my camera to capture the rock formations and the wide, empty horizon. As I walked, Max sniffed the ground constantly, occasionally pausing to growl at something I couldn't see. The further I went, the quieter it became. No birds, no insects, nothing but the wind brushing across the rocks. Late in the afternoon, I started heading back to the cabin. That's when I saw it. At first, just a shadow flitting between the trees. I froze, my stomach tightening. The shape was hunched, moving in a way that was almost human but not quite. It slipped from tree to tree like it was watching me. I tried to keep calm, told myself it was probably just a deer or some other animal. But then it stepped into a patch of light, and I could see it clearly. It was wrong. Its limbs were long, disproportionately so, and its head was too large, the features stretched, almost like someone had tried to mimic a human face but failed. Its eyes caught the sunlight, and they weren't quite right. Too dark, too empty. Max barked suddenly, the sound startling, and it froze. The figure vanished almost instantly, melting back into the shadows. My heart pounded as I grabbed Max and ran the rest of the way to the cabin. That night, I barely slept. Every rustle, every snapping twig made me jump. I kept the fire going, sitting close to it with Max by my side. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again. Outside, circling the cabin, heavy footsteps on the dry earth. Max growled, low and warning, and that guttural, unnatural sound came again. I didn't dare look out the window, but I could feel it there, watching, testing. Hours passed like that. By dawn, it had gone. Or at least it had stopped making noise, but I didn't sleep again. The following day, I decided I couldn't stay in the cabin any longer. I packed up my gear quickly, intending to drive back to town. As I stepped outside, Max froze, growling, hackles raised. There, at the edge of the tree-line, was the figure again. This time, it was closer, standing upright, just at the limit of the shadows. I could see it clearly. Long, sinewy limbs, a face twisted like it was human but not human, dark, soulless eyes, and a body that seemed too thin, too fast, like it could snap a bone in an instant. I didn't wait. I ran to the truck with Max at my heels, jumped in, and slammed the doors shut. The figure moved with us as we pulled onto the dirt road, keeping pace with the truck, silent but terrifyingly fast. I drove hard, the tires throwing up clouds of dust, the engine screaming. I didn't look back, but I could feel it there, following, keeping up. It wasn't until I reached the paved highway, a good 20 miles from the cabin, that I felt some relief. When I finally glanced in the rearview mirror, it was gone. No shadow, no figure, nothing. Just the empty desert stretching behind me. I didn't stop driving until I reached Pinedale, where I called Hank to tell him I wouldn't be staying after all. Later, I researched local reports. People in that area spoke of strange sightings in the desert. Creatures that could mimic human forms, move unnaturally fast, and vanish into the night. Some called them skinwalkers. I never went back to that cabin. Even now, years later, I still have trouble explaining what I saw. Max never seemed scared in the same way around anything else. He was a brave dog, but that night he refused to leave my side. I've stayed in plenty of remote cabins since, and I've never felt anything like that again. Something was out there, something that wasn't quite human, something that had been watching me. And I know that if I had stayed even one more night, it would have come closer. I tell this story only to warn anyone who ventures deep into the deserts of northern Arizona or New Mexico. Out there, the isolation isn't just loneliness. The land hides things that move like us, think like us, but aren't us. And when you see them, it's already too late to turn back. I remember the day I first drove up to that cabin like it was etched into my memory forever. It was late October 1987, and I had just turned 25. The drive from Minneapolis to northern Minnesota had been long, but I had wanted to escape the noise and the endless city lights. My old Jeep rattled as I wound along the gravel road, trees on either side thick and heavy, their branches black against the pale late afternoon sky. The air was sharp, smelling of wet leaves and pine sap, the kind of smell that makes you feel alive and nervous all at once. The cabin itself was small, more of a shack really, tucked into a clearing with the forest pressing close on every side. I had found it through a listing in a local magazine, an old man renting it out for hunting season. The place had been built in the 1930s, weathered wood warped by decades of wind and snow, a thin plume of smoke rising from the stone chimney. Its windows were dusty, the glass slightly warped, reflecting the darkening sky like a dull mirror. I parked the Jeep on the uneven ground and climbed out, feeling the cold settle in through my jacket. My dog, Max, a husky mix with a thick gray coat, jumped down from the seat, sniffing the air as if he knew something I didn't. The first thing I noticed inside the cabin was the smell, stale, musty, but tinged with the sharp scent of wood smoke and old pine. The floors creaked under every step. The furniture was sparse. A rickety wooden table with 2 chairs, a small bed with a thin mattress, and a metal stove that looked like it hadn't been used in years. Dust coated everything in a fine layer, and cobwebs clung to the corners of the ceiling. I set my bags down and lit the stove, the smell of burning wood mingling with the mustiness in a way that made me feel slightly more at home. That night, the forest felt alive in a way that made me tense. Wind rattled the windows, and I could hear the branches scraping against the walls. Max slept at the foot of my bed, ears twitching every time an animal moved outside. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was just the wind and the sounds of the forest. But every few minutes, I thought I heard something else, something heavier, deliberate, moving through the trees. The next morning, I went out to explore, camera in hand. The forest around the cabin was thick with birch and pine, the ground littered with last year's leaves, slick and wet from the frost overnight. I followed a faint trail that led downhill to a small creek. The water ran clear and cold, the kind of water that makes you shiver if you dip your hand in. I noticed footprints in the mud near the bank. Not mine, not Max's, too large for the dog. They looked recent. My stomach tightened, but I told myself it was probably a hunter or someone passing through. When I returned to the cabin, I noticed the door handle was wet. Not soaked, just damp, like someone had touched it with a wet hand. The thought made my heart skip, and I checked the locks. Everything was secure, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Max growled low in his throat, ears pricked, staring at the doorway. The next 2 days were tense. Every sound outside, the crack of a branch, the rustle of leaves, made me jump. I went out to collect firewood, carrying my rifle, though I doubted I would ever have to use it. The forest seemed quiet in a strange way, almost too quiet, like it was holding its breath. I found more footprints, larger ones, circling the cabin, but never close enough to see a person. I marked them in my notebook, careful to document the direction, size, and depth, trying to stay rational. By the third night, the wind had picked up. It rattled the roof like a drum, and the sound of the trees scraping together was deafening. Max wouldn't stop pacing, whining softly. I kept the stove going, the warmth barely enough to keep the chill out. Around midnight, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of someone walking outside. Not a deer, not an animal, slow, heavy steps pressing against the snow and leaves. I froze, heart hammering, listening. The steps circled the cabin, stopping now and then. I grabbed my rifle, my hands shaking, and crouched near the window. The thing I remember most clearly is the silence after. The steps stopped abruptly, like whoever it was had vanished. I strained my eyes into the blackness, Max growling low. Hours passed, the wind died down, and I finally forced myself to sleep. I woke before dawn, and the first thing I saw was prints in the frost, leading away from the cabin and into the thick trees. No footprints returned. The rest of my stay was spent with that tension, with every shadow and noise a potential threat. I never saw the person again, but I could feel them. I stayed alert, moved slowly, and kept Max close. I realized that the fear wasn't just about someone being outside. It was about the cabin itself, the isolation, the way the forest could hide anything. When I finally left, I packed quickly, not daring to look back. The drive back to Minneapolis was long, but the fear didn't leave me. I kept checking the rearview mirror, imagining figures between the trees, the isolation lingering in my chest. Max sat silently beside me, ears flicking at every sound, his presence the only comfort I had. I never returned to that cabin. Years later, I learned from locals that it had been abandoned for decades before I rented it. There had been rumors of squatters and hunters using it illegally, but no one had ever been caught. I realized then that what I had experienced was real, grounded in human fear, the kind that doesn't need ghosts to be terrifying. The isolation, the forest, the uncertainty, it was enough. Even now, when I tell the story, I feel that same chill in my chest, that sense of being watched, that gnawing doubt that someone, somewhere, had been following me, curious about the city man and his dog in their woods. And in a way, I'm glad. It reminds me that the world is bigger, darker, and stranger than our routines let us see. And that sometimes, leaving quickly is the smartest thing you can do.